Great. So good afternoon, everyone. In this paper, I'm asking a kind of deliberately broad question, which is basically how do we analyze a DJ set? I think this is important for a few reasons. Next slide. So it's pretty obvious that dance music is DJ centric, but we can refine that a bit and say dance music is also performance and event centric. That's something we're seeing post-COVID with the rise of the bedroom DJ as a kind of category. Admittedly, this work is a bit of a pragmatic response to me having to work from home for almost half my PhD now. Analyzing recorded sets on YouTube is just convenient. But there's kind of a broader point to be made here that DJ culture is often the kind of star of the show in our field, but analyzing what DJs do on stage and in performance is kind of a little bit overlooked. So what am I actually talking about here? I'm talking about analyzing recordings. So a 60-minute DJ set from YouTube, for example. I'm focusing specifically on turntable and mixer performance. So putting aside laptop and other types of performance, which are, they exist and they're valid. And I'm taking a musicological approach. And I'll go over this later in more detail, but I'm specifically interested in techniques and skills and gestures. So what you're doing with your hands and fingers on a mixer or a turntable, but also kind of larger scale ideas about how tracks are grouped together to manage mood and energy and emotion over time in a set. If you ever sit down to try and do something like this, you'll probably encounter challenges like I did. Your source material of recorded sets online is, the variation within that is enormous. So you might have one camera angle or 10 or no video at all. The question then you have to ask is, what gear is the DJ using? Can I see it? Is that mixer or effects unit available in my country? Is the sound quality good enough, and so on. You can also try recording yourself, and some scholars do this, but that requires good equipment, good sound. You need to be socially ethical and have the right access, of course. So as a musicologist as well, you need to ask some important questions. What are you actually measuring? BPM is the first thing you gravitate to, and that's what I've studied as well a little bit. But when you go into gestures, hands on the mixer, faders, energy, what constitutes a warm-up section versus a hype section in a set, and where do you draw the line? These things are really qualitative and hard to judge sometimes. And then there's visualizing your results as well in graphs and so on, and I'll show a little bit of that later. So in the field, there is a decent amount of literature, but Mark Butler, who many of us have probably read, stands out as a kind of primary voice. Interestingly to me, though, his work a lot of it is about conceptual groundwork and not always of the analysis itself. So he interrogates the kind of category of what is the musical work in EDM, what is the performance in EDM. When it does come to analysis, it's often about texture. So kind of dub plates and private records that DJs have in techno scenes, and the way that they mix their kind of mix and manipulate and digitally kind of remix their own works over time. And that's what allows Butler to really dig into what is the original, what's the copy, what's the mix, what's the remix, and these kind of philosophical questions. As I said, the musical focus is Berlin, Detroit, minimal techno. And his visualizations are quite simple. And I want to give a big shout out to the rest of the scholars on screen here. It's a short presentation, so I won't discuss everyone, but also I'm really grateful to Lawrence Gilly, who's given me a small preview of his research coming out this year. And a lot of my paper is inspired by that. So just picking at one specific thing that Butler contributes, he theorizes these things called musical technologies: grooving, cycling, flowing. There are a few others. To me, they're more like affects, like an affect theory, or feelings or notions, something you do in performance. And I want to kind of twist that and bring that into the context of genre. So my basic claim is that groove, continuity, cycling, flowing, these things are really native priorities in house, disco, and techno, what we might call the kind of canon of electronic dance music. But as soon as we shift our focus elsewhere in EDM, groove and a sense of continuous sound is maybe not as important to other DJs. Edward Spencer has just finished an amazing thesis on the drop in bass music. And that's a really valuable lesson in how DJs and songs and performance in bass music is structured around rupture and breaks in continuity. So it might seem obvious, but EDM is more than just disco, house, techno, and we just had a drum and bass panel earlier. So I'm really just trying to encourage analysts to expand their lens outside of the kind of dance music canon, because I'm kind of suggesting that these musical technologies like the drop and rupture, even notions like hype, they can have really significant flow-on effects for how a DJ beat matches, their relationship with the MC, maybe how people dance and respond to the music, and so on. And just a final bit of theory, and going through the kind of field and trying to come to terms with what DJ set analysis is, I've developed this basic 3-tiered model. So you start with a meta-level analysis. This is kind of social and cultural research like identity, context of the venue and the space, maybe corporate branding and sponsorship. I'm doing a boiler room set analysis at the moment, and boiler room comes with a lot of social cultural baggage. And then the next 2 tiers are more musical, macro and micro scales of analysis. And this can be thought of as a horizontal arrangement of sounds over time, and the vertical arrangement, which is moment by moment, immediate, kind of real-time mixing. In particular, in this paper, I want to focus on the macro level, so how the transitions between certain tracks kind of create clusters, chapters, or paragraphs, something that gets stitched together in the kind of longer story of the DJ set. And BPM trajectory over time, or energy or mood or affect, is a key part of that. So my short case study is on a duo called Gorgon Sound from Bristol in the UK. These guys mainly operate in dubstep and sort of grime circles, but this is a roots reggae inspired project. When you hear the examples in a second, it should become quite obvious that the sound they're involved in, it's sometimes nicknamed stepper dub. So if you imagine a 4x4 groove kick drum, and then it's very structured around kind of an EDM bass music drop and build up, about 140 beats per minute. And these guys brand their brand is kind of, they call it strictly offline business. So only dubplate and vinyl mixing, releasing their own hand-stamped vinyl records, and so on. They still have an online presence, so I suggest it's kind of hybrid, really. And in this performance I'm looking at, the tempo ranges from 130 up to nearly 150 BPM, and they really kind of use a wide range of mixing styles and transitions, which kind of just, again, speaks to kind of hybridity in bass music and DJing. So here we go. Okay. Yeah. So just before I play the video example, and this is kind of an illustration of how I do the research. Just like Butler, I put together a detailed track list with BPMs, artists, and detailed notes on how the actual micro level transitions are made, including hands-on faders and mixer knobs, effects, and so on. And I just want to highlight these 4 transitions. It ranges from simple things like beat matching to powering down the turntable as a form of a transition. Sometimes they beat match, sometimes they don't. And then there's a pull-up kind of climax at the end.
All London massive all tight.
Now introducing to the world.
Yeah.
The Universal Field Marshal, so with them partial, all official Gargan, so with the man called Kang and me.
Sounds of the Gargan. As we keep it moving. Big up to man like Aisha. Young Emperor represent. London. And again, walla long leg. Walla long leg. Walla long leg. Style with a bomber card. Walla long leg. Walla long leg. Walla long leg. Style with a bomber card. Walla long leg. Walla long leg. Walla long leg. London. Walla long leg. Walla long leg.
So that was just a few highlights of the set. And in my kind of macro level analysis, I've tried to sum up everything in a visual graph here. You can see BPM on the side and time on the lower axis. And so that clip number 3, which was a 130 beats per minute track, and that's kind of the sharp speed transition in the middle of the set. They literally just faded down a track at 130, played the next record at 140, and just faded it in. Previously, they'd been beat matching very smoothly, paying attention to kind of a sense of continuity. But when it came to, this is an improvised performance, so when it came to, right, let's lift the energy, suddenly beat matching wasn't important anymore, and they just went straight to 140. So this is the kind of interesting on-the-fly, improvisational and hybrid kind of stylistic decision-making that I'm really interested in, and it creates effectively, I think, a kind of a warm-up section and then a section where they decide to move towards higher energy and hype. And you can see they kept going up to around almost 150, and there's another rewind pull-up section at the end. So kind of some basic takeaways. Obviously, mapping BPM towards increasing excitement or energy isn't especially radical or new in EDM. But there's an interesting ideology in artists like this in bass music that I think they attempt to make the records speak for themselves. So in the transition between records is when most of the DJing is being done. But when the records are playing, it's just, check the lows are sounding good, maybe pull the highs down a little, very subtle EQing, but the rest is just letting the record play. And so my kind of takeaway is that this is somewhere on an interesting continuum between a pure reggae selector who doesn't mix the records at all and a modern dubstep DJ where the drops and smooth transitions mean everything. And I'm still working on some questions like, is my judge of the crowd reaction good or accurate? Just because the crowd reacted to the pull-ups and the MC, I need to work on that. Is that accurate? And there are kind of meta social questions as well about the boiler room context. So some basic conclusions. This is all very preliminary analysis, but I think Butler's technologies like grooving and such are really valuable concepts, and I'm trying to introduce the drop and others as kind of new additions to that vocabulary that he creates. I presented my 3 planes model with the meta, macro, and micro scales of analysis, and hopefully all of this is useful for kind of an emerging subfield. Thank you.
I love you guys for all being so on time. This is amazing. Thank you so much. That's really, really interesting. I might take the first question as such as prerogative and just ask you, talk about musicology, and you sort of mentioned musical elements. I guess, how would you sum up how you're trying to kind of negotiate a space between the musical and physical gestures? Where does the sort of interrelationship work in your project?
Yeah, so I'm yeah, I guess I wasn't particularly clear on that, but there's some research by Philip Tagg, and he comes up with some vocabulary like musemes, these like elements of a genre that you can quote and like articulate. You know, you hear a particular like a square wave synth, and you go, okay, that reminds me of early 2000s grime, or you hear like a cross stick and a spring reverb, and you're like, okay, that sounds like 70s dub. So that's where I'm bringing musicology into it. That like there are certain ways that certain tracks evoke a genre or quote elements of a genre. Yeah, and that's kind of my way in to making it musicological. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Anyone else got any questions? One from Maria. Are you measuring energy solely in terms of BPM, or do you have plans to extract other audio features, e.g. for corresponding, you can read it, tonal brightness, roughness, etc.? Thank you, Maria.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. That's an awesome question. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but I think that's an awesome suggestion. Yeah, so you're thinking of like a spectrogram analysis type of thing? Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, I'll write that down. Thank you.
I guess there is an interesting kind of question about positionality and what you're interpreting these words to mean and how you understand it based on whatever your experience is. And yeah, maybe there are any ways to kind of objectify some of the stuff. Great question from Patrick. You take into account the ways that EQing takes place, the techniques common, the way that other kinds of fades, etc., are taken into consideration, which I guess is about the physicality of what's going on and how that relates to your analyses.
Yeah, the short answer is I'm working on it, basically. Yeah, using Butler as a model, it's not always particularly helpful. Like he shows a diagram, like a list of actions that the DJs do in some of his analysis, but it's literally just lines in a table that say like left hand on mixer, 37 point this seconds, and then right hand on volume fader. I don't know. So it's kind of really up to you to watch the videos in great detail and yeah, and decide what your take is on how the EQing works. I mean, I agree that that's a good thing to look into for sure.
And Patrick slightly kind of clarified something I heard misinterpreted, which is about the idea of its stylistic kind of tropes and these gestures in particular relation to the expectations of the genre and whether that's going to feature in any way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think like the problem with me at the moment is that I haven't done much comparative analysis yet. So I'm like literally just sticking with dub in Bristol at the moment. So probably when I look at other genres and like just absorb a greater amount of analysis, I can speak to that kind of question more. Sorry, it's a terrible answer.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. It sounds like your cat is in need of some attention behind you. So thank you very much for your presentation. Lots to think about.